And we are live. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for being late. It's a Strasbourg week, so our guest, Mr. McAllister, is very busy. He's running from meeting to meeting, so we had to delay a little bit the beginning. So apologies again. So I will go quickly through the introduction so that we can dive into the interview itself. So, like I said, our guest tonight is MEP David McAllister. He's German and he's a member of the European Parliament from the EPP, sorry. So we're on the right side, center-right side of EU politics. He's been an MEP since 2014, so it's his second mandate now. Why do I invite him tonight? David McAllister is the chair, so the president of the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, and he's also a substitute member in the Committee on International Trade and the Committee on Security and Defense. So as you can guess, we're going to talk quite a bit about EU foreign affairs, EU defense, these sort of things. As usual, a quick reminder of the rules. I have prepared my question for Mr. McAllister. You may react, you may suggest questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on it, and I will relay your questions if they are relevant to the topic, if we have time, this sort of thing, you know how it works. Our guest will stay with us for 1 hour, big maximum. I don't want to take too much of his time, it's late already. And after that, you will go enjoy the rest of his evening, but you will be stuck with me for another 30 to 45 minutes to debrief the interview, discuss a bit further with you, answer additional questions, these sort of things. And on this extremely fast introduction, I suggest that we dive right in. Good evening, David McAllister. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer our questions tonight. So before we start, you heard me do the very, very quick introduction of yourself. Is there anything I missed that you would like to say about yourself before we start?
No, all fine. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right. Well, first, let's start with you. So it's your second mandate now as in the European Parliament, but could you tell us a bit how and why did you go into politics and then later became an MEP? What's your story?
I got engaged in politics already as a young man. I joined the youth organization of my party, the German CDU, at the age of 16, 17. I was engaged as a student, but after finishing my studies, I went back to my hometown in northern Germany, where I then got engaged in local politics. I was a member of the local council, I was a member of the district council, and I kind of developed an interest in doing concrete politics, and this then later on led to my candidature for the regional parliament of the Niedersachsen Landtag, where we were first in the opposition and then in the majority, and I climbed the ladder to finally become Minister President of Niedersachsen. So I've always been very politically engaged. After 16 years in regional politics in northern Germany, I thought it was time to call it a day at the regional level. And then I ran in 2014 for the European Parliament. I have a German-British background. I was raised speaking both languages. I have until today both passports. I am a convinced European. I strongly believe in the future of the European Union, and that's why I'm very proud and honored now to be engaged in the European Parliament for 10 years, especially serving as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
So speaking of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the EU and the European Parliament actually have rather limited competence when it comes to foreign affairs. So what is exactly the role of the AFET Committee, so the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament?
By size, the AFET Committee is the second largest committee in the European Parliament. We are scrutinizing the work, on the one hand, of Josep Borrell, who is the High Representative, but also the Vice President of the Commission. He's the man responsible for the external affairs of the European Union. And on the other hand, we are scrutinizing the work of Oliver Verhey, the Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighbourhood Policy. The European Parliament has increased its role in shaping EU foreign policy. On the one hand, of course, we are scrutinizing the work of the two commissioners I just mentioned. We also have a role to play as an agenda setter. Then don't underestimate the role of the European Parliament when it comes to enlargement policies. In the end, every new member of the European Union needs to find approval by the European Parliament. That's why the European Parliament is very much engaged in the annual country reports, dealing with the progress or the less progress made in enlargement countries. And finally, we also play a role as co-legislator when it comes to foreign affairs and defense-related files. Just 2 weeks ago, for instance, we concluded the trilogue on the Ukraine facility, the 50 billion euros package, which was an important step forward, not only for Ukraine, but also for our support as European Union. So, of course, foreign policy in many fields is still a topic, a remit of national governments and national parliaments, but the role of the European Union in common foreign and security policy has definitely increased. We are playing a much bigger role, especially since the Treaty of Lisbon went into force in 2009, where the actors were created. We are now dealing with the European External Action Service, or for instance, the position of the High Representative Vice President.
And so you mentioned the Parliament is having a bigger role now since Lisbon in the foreign affairs issues, but in the context of the resolutions that you're doing in the Parliament, in the context of the trilogues you negotiate, how much of actual influence did the Parliament manage to have? Like, do you have examples of a push that the Parliament led with on resolution or legislation that led to actual change in the ground? Because, like you said, foreign affairs, defense policy, it's not only to a large extent a national policy, but it's very much linked to sovereignty, national sovereignty. So it's very difficult to make member states move their position.
I'll give you two examples. On the one hand, the European Parliament has always been the driver for enlargement policy, but we now have Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Georgia, also with the European perspective, has been a call coming from the European Parliament way before the Commission and finally the European Council took this historic decision just before Christmas. So on enlargement, the European Parliament is always very active, reforming the enlargement process, but also making it more conditional, but also giving future EU member states a concrete perspective. And the second item I would like to now mention is European defense and security. Now top on the agenda of European affairs. For many, many years, the European Parliament has been calling for a closer, coordinated common security and defense policy. And we are now finally making progress. This is something where certainly the European Parliament can be proud of being a concrete driver of reform and progress.
And so we'll talk a bit about defense policy a bit later. For now, I would like to start with what is like the most burning news. We just entered the third year of the war in Ukraine, which is of course a major focus of the EU in terms of foreign policy over the past couple of years. So could you briefly explain the position the EU took since the beginning of the conflict and why the EU has been so swift and so strong in its support to Ukraine? What is different than other foreign affairs events that occur around the world?
2 years of Russian war of aggression against Ukraine mean 2 years of violence, 2 years of brutality, 2 years of destruction. And we shall never forget the initial shock of attack, the horror of the events in Bucha or Mariupol, just to name 2 Ukrainian cities. And yet, in spite the continuing atrocities and despite the suffering inflicted on the Ukrainian people, Ukraine is standing firm. I think it is absolutely remarkable how the brave Ukrainian men and women are demonstrating fortitude and determination in defending their homeland and fighting for their freedom. But they're not only fighting for their own freedom, they are fighting for our shared European values, because this Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is a fundamental attack on the European peace and security architecture. And that is why we are standing in solidarity with Ukraine. Never before have we supported a third country like we have supported Ukraine economically, financially, politically, in a humanitarian way, and also militarily. And never before have we sanctioned a third country like the Russian Federation, because we want to make very clear the Russian Federation under Mr. Putin is the aggressor in this war, and that we cannot, under no circumstances, accept this imperialist attitude in the Kremlin.
And you mentioned that the EU has been never supported another third country like this, especially on the military side of things. But these days, a key issue in the European support is the question of weapons and ammunition that is being sent to Ukraine, and the EU is likely going to miss the target of 1 million artillery shells it was supposed to send by March, contrary to the Iran and North Korea, which is being flooding Russia with weapons to feed the war effort. France insists on for that any artillery shells sent to Ukraine should be made in the EU, while other countries says, well, wherever they come from, we just need to send the weapons to Ukraine. Where do you stand on this whole debate on the buy European debate when it comes to support to Ukraine?
We have said that we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. But I think we need to go a step further. It's not only as long as it takes, it is whatever it takes. That's why the European Parliament, across group lines, has called on member states to ramp up the production of ammunition. Whatever is available, we need to deliver to the Ukrainians, because this is what they desperately need: ammunition. You can have brave women and men fighting at the front line. Without ammunition, things will get grim. That's why, for me personally, it's a secondary question where the ammunition is coming from. The main thing is that the ammunition, the weapons the Ukrainians need, are being provided to the Ukrainian armed forces.
Actually, today, most EU member states, head of states and government, were meeting in Paris to discuss how they can support better Ukraine in the future. So, what would you like to see coming out of this meeting of the head of states and government?
Ukraine needs our support at all levels, humanitarian-wise, militarily, but of course also economically and financially. And for us at the European Union level, it was extremely important that we got the Ukraine facility up and running. The European Parliament will finally vote on the Ukraine facility this week. For us, this Ukraine facility will provide Ukraine with three important points. First, direct financial support in the form of grants and loans. Then second, the mobilization of private investment in Ukraine through guarantees. And finally, the final assistance and capacity building programs for the central, regional and local levels of government, civil society in Ukraine. So these are three important pillars, 50 billion euros for the next 4 years. So the Ukrainians have predictability that they can plan better. For us, important is that all the money we are giving to the Ukrainians, 3 points need to be guaranteed. First of all, a broad spectrum of stakeholders need to be involved in the relevant ministries. So this also includes experts and representatives of civil society. Second, the reconstruction of Ukraine must comply with the European guidelines of the European Green Deal. And third, the reconstruction should be a kind of a catalyst for the necessary reforms. So what I'm trying to say is, the reconstruction of Ukraine should already be a major step forward for the Ukrainians on their European integration path. If we reconstruct Ukraine, and we will do this together, let's do it in a way that they can already have easier access to the European single market and finally to the European Union. And a final point I didn't mention yet is we need to extend the EU military mission, the training mission. This is a very tangible support for the Ukrainian armed forces, where I would like to commend the good work, especially the Polish, the Germans and other EU partners are doing.
Something that you mentioned already, the slogan is we will support Ukraine for how long it takes, but how far should the EU go in its support to Ukraine? What is the red line? Like we know that there is, for instance, in Germany, the current government is reluctant to send some weapons, the tourist missiles to Ukraine. In France, in my case, there's a lot of debates on whether further support would trigger a war with Russia, would make us belligerent. So, how far should the EU go?
Our support for Ukraine should be conducted in a manner that Ukraine is capable of defending its territory, its sovereignty, its freedom against the Russian invasion. And Ukraine needs to be put in a position that the Russian side understands that it cannot fulfill its military goals through this war. And then, if this happens, that the Russian side understands that they cannot succeed, then we might have a way forward for discussing a ceasefire, negotiating a ceasefire, which in the end could lead to a peace. But the conditions for a possible ceasefire and peace, the conditions will be formulated by the Ukrainian government. And it is the Ukrainians who decide what is acceptable and what not. For me, it is clear the Russian military, personnel, and equipment needs to leave Ukrainian territory full scale, and I'm talking about the borders of 2014. And we are constantly increasing the pressure on the Russian Federation. Putin's declared aim was to divide Europe. He didn't succeed. Despite seeming relentless, Russia is failing on multiple objectives. The war is primarily, until now, a military failure for Putin. Russia's failure is also economic. And finally, Russia's failure is also diplomatic. For example, Finland has joined NATO and Sweden is about to follow now. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is closer than ever on its path towards the European Union. So these are the points where we are. If you look at the Kremlin's propaganda machine, it's not surprising. It's running at full speed and it continues to spread apocalyptic threats. But the rhetoric fits into a pattern that we have observed since the beginning of this Russian war of aggression. Putin is constantly trying to intimidate and divide the people in Europe. He will not succeed.
And you mentioned that the war is a failure economically for Putin. There's been a lot of debate on the effectiveness of the sanctions against Russia, with a number of experts pointing out that while there's been a lot of sanctions being pronounced against Russia, their effectiveness is not proved because, for instance, third countries are being used to circumvent the sanctions. So overall, how do you assess the actual effectiveness of these sanctions against Russia?
Well, I said Russia's failure is economic. The sanctions have decoupled the Russian economy from modern technology and innovation. Russia is cut off. And one thing is for sure, Russia is now more dependent on China than ever before. We have adopted 12 sanctions packages as European Union. The 13th sanctions package is about to be finalized. That is putting maximum pressure on the Russian Federation. But yes, indeed, you are right. We need to have a look at the circumvention of sanctions. That's why I welcome that the European Union has now appointed a special envoy, David O'Sullivan, a very experienced Irish diplomat who had leading positions in the European Commission. We need to talk to third countries who are, in the moment, still making it possible that certain products, that certain items are being delivered to Russia and they are being used on the battlefield against the Ukrainians.
But in the chat, someone is pointing out that, I mean, indeed, there is real circumvention because we see the trade relation between Russia and Kazakhstan, Russia and Kyrgyzstan. Even Georgia even said that they would refuse to implement some of the sanctions because they literally said that it was economically a good deal for them to maintain these links.
Well, you're right. You mentioned some of the countries in Central Asia. They are, for instance, in the focus of the European Commission. And we have made clear to our partners in Central Asia that we cannot accept the circumvention of sanctions. We all have a responsibility to empower the resistance of the Ukrainians, especially now that Russia is stepping up its attacks on civilian infrastructure, trying to demobilize the Ukrainian people. It's hard work, But we will continue, and we need to be very clear to our friends that we cannot accept under no circumstances the circumvention of sanctions.
And one final question on that before we move on to the next topic. There's a lot of debate for months now on the potential use of the frozen Russian funds. At the beginning of the war, when one of the first decisions that was taken was to freeze the Russian funds in Europe and beyond. And the question has been whether these funds should be just kept frozen or used or given to Ukraine to fund the war effort and the reconstruction. Are you in favor of giving away all the Russian money that is currently frozen to Ukraine, or do you think it should be just about the profits on this frozen fund, or we should not use them at all to give them to Ukraine?
First of all, just to conclude on the sanctions, I think it's important to point out that Putin is finding himself in an impossible way to solve I would call it trilemma. He must, on the one hand, finance the ongoing war against Ukraine. He must maintain the population standard of living, and he must ensure macroeconomic stability. But in order to achieve the first two goals I mentioned, Putin has to increase spending, which drives up inflation, making the third goal a distant prospect. So I do believe that the sanctions will work long term. On the frozen assets, the European Parliament has been clear on this matter, more outspoken than the member states. We believe that the frozen Russian assets should be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Okay, very clear. Moving on to a linked topic, a bit different, is the question of European defense, which has come back on the forefront for the past couple of years. And now we hear the idea of a commissioner that will be dedicated to defense. It's an idea that has been supported by now candidate Ursula von der Leyen. Is that an idea that you support, and what should this commissioner for defense potentially do in the next mandate?
I support the idea of creating an own commissioner with the portfolio for security and defense. I think this would be a right and a better structure in the European Commission. There have been many calls from my political family, the European People's Party, in this matter, but also from other groups in the European Parliament. This new commissioner should mainly be responsible for moving things forward on the fully fledged European Defence Union. That is one of the big goals for the next years in the European Union. First of all, this man or this woman will be responsible for ramping up the production of defense capabilities in Europe. We altogether will have to spend more and spend better on defense and security. I strongly believe that this should happen at a European level more than in the moment. So it's about ramping up the defense production. It's about coming up with plans how we can jointly do better on defense research, defense testing, but especially defense purchasing. And the long term will be a European defense force, but that's a long way to go. What we first of all now need to do is to create a single market for defense and ramp up our defense production, because this is important if we want to join forces in Europe. We need joint equipment, joint vehicles, joint weapon systems, and others. But one point I would like to underline is that our activities should always be closely coordinated with NATO. It's about strengthening the European pillar of NATO. It's not doing something against or in competition with NATO.
And so, if I understand well, for you, the idea of a European defense should be to start from the industry, build an industry around defense, and then in the longer term, build maybe a form of European army or whatever form it may take. But we need to start from the capacities, from the more material thing, more than before the idea of a EU army or whatever it's called.
Indeed, I think we should be very careful using these terms, because they have very different repercussions in member states. Some member states are much more comfortable with this kind of idea than others. I'm also fully aware of the debates, for instance, in France. the strategic compass adopted by the heads of state and government just shortly after the beginning of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, for me is kind of a concrete book, a concrete plan how to move forward on the European Defence Union. We have now set a structure in recent years how to move forward on this matter with the permanent structured cooperation, with the European Defence Fund, with the European Defence Agency, with programs to jointly procure ammunition and other items. So we are on the right track, but there's still a long, long way to go. And I just think it makes sense that somebody in the European Commission is actually responsible for these concrete matters. Hopefully we will see a Commissioner for Defence and Security in the next Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen.
And so you mentioned that for you, EU defense should not be in competition with NATO. It should work together. So how do you see this potential cooperation with NATO, especially given the latest declaration of candidate Donald Trump? We'll discuss that a bit later because it has an impact on EU-US relations. But how do you see this cooperation with NATO?
NATO is the bedrock of our security. NATO guarantees our security, and that means our liberty in Europe. And we should have a very huge interest in having the closest possible relations with our transatlantic partners, with the United States and Canada. NATO and the EU are two different organizations, and both organizations shouldn't be doing the same. Each organization should be doing what it is there for, and that what we are doing is real added value. The European Union should step in with defense and security structures where NATO isn't present. NATO doesn't want to be active or cannot be active. We now have adopted already 3 EU-NATO declarations in the recent years. I think that the relations of our two organizations have definitely improved over the last few years. I would like to give also credit to the former Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and to the current and future Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who worked on these declarations together with Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Perhaps you can put it this way: we will remain transatlantic, but we will become more European. I think that's the way forward in the next years.
So it's about more the EU being a bit less reliant, but still being part of the alliance, so that it works no matter what, and works where NATO cannot work. If I understand.
Well, Finland has now joined NATO. Sweden will join NATO. That means only very few EU member states are not also in NATO. It's Ireland, it's Austria, it's Malta, and it's Cyprus. So most of our family are also in NATO. And that's why I think it's fair to say to strengthen the European pillar within NATO is the way forward. But I also would like to mention that 80% of NATO's spending is spent by NATO member states who are not in the European Union. The United States, Canada, Turkey, the United Kingdom, Norway. That shows you that there is a bit of an imbalance. And that's why I believe that we need to really step up our defense spending at an EU level, at the level of the member states. But let's spend this additional money we are going to take into our hands because we need to do more for security and defense. Let's spend it wisely. And wisely spending means let's do better cooperation at a European level.
Final question on this. Not related to defense directly, but let's not a scandal, a polemic that has emerged in the past couple of weeks has been the news that a number of MEPs apparently have seen their phones being hacked. Members of the Security and Defense committee, to be precise, and that there was spyware, trace of spyware on their phone. Since you're a substitute member in the CD committee, so the Security and Defense, have you had your phone checked by the cybersecurity unit in the Parliament to see if there was anything fishy happening there, and what was the result if you did the check?
Well, good that you're asking. I'm going to have my check tomorrow. So tomorrow noon, I will be able to answer your question or not. Of course, I read these articles with huge interest, also with huge concern, and immediately asked our security services to also check my phone. So I will be able to answer your question tomorrow.
And then waiting the result for tomorrow, like, can you explain briefly, like, why would any foreign power, assuming it's a foreign power, would want to spy on MEPs in the Security and Defense Committee? Like, what are you doing there that is such a big deal for countries outside of the EU?
Well, first of all, this is outrageous to tap phones of elected members of parliament. This is totally illegal, and I think it should be made public who is behind this, if it's possible to find out. And of course, this will have serious consequences. What's the aim of it all? Well, MEPs, of course, get a lot of important information, and foreign services, especially adversaries of the European Union, are always obviously interested in finding out something. I think this is a real scandalous thing, and I think we need to dig deeper into what has actually happened.
All right. Well, we fingers crossed. There's nothing wrong happening on your phone. Especially it's highly illegal. What's going on there?
Well, here's my phone. I'll know more tomorrow.
Keep us posted. Something we very briefly discussed is the question of EU-US relations. The past few months, there's a number of countries that are very, very worried of the prospect of a potential return of Donald Trump as US president from next year. How do you think the EU should adapt, or should the EU adapt its relation to the US if Donald Trump was to come back as president of the United States?
Well, first of all, we need to wait simply who will be the next US president. We Europeans will not be able to decide this. It's up to the American people. But one thing is clear, a possible re-election of Mr. Trump would once again put our transatlantic relations on shaky ground, especially with regard to NATO, Ukraine, global trade, or our cooperation on climate protection. We in Europe need to be prepared for any outcome, a second term of Mr. Biden or a new term of Mr. Trump. What we do know is that during Mr. Trump's first term in office from 2016 to 2020, that showed that he doesn't necessarily share our view that in times of global conflicts and crises, an effective and trusting transatlantic alliance is actually essential.
Moving on to another, like the other, let's say, big foreign affairs issue of these days is the situation in the Middle East. There, the situation it has been a bit more complicated, to say the least, for the EU to find and maintain a united line, contrary to what happened, for instance, on Ukraine, where quickly everyone was aligned. In the case of Israel, it's been more difficult, and President von der Leyen, for instance, has been criticized for taking a position that was seen as being a bit too one-sided. So, do you think that all this difficulty in finding a united message on the conflict in Israel and with Hamas, did you miss an opportunity to be a relevant player in the potential resolution of the conflict? Well, resolution of the conflict might be a bit ambitious, but to be an influential player in this side of the world.
On the 7th of October last year, more people were killed solely because of their Jewish faith than at any other day since the end of the Shoah. And I am still deeply, deeply saddened by this fact. And it leaves so many numb with pain and bewilderment. This attack by Hamas was a terrorist attack on Israel, and Israel has a legitimate right to self-defense. That's why Israel is conducting a war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But of course, Israel has to follow international law and international humanitarian law, and the Israeli actions need to be proportionate.
And so do you feel that
too many people are dying in the Gaza Strip, and the humanitarian catastrophe is there. That's why the European Parliament has called for fire pauses so that the population can be provided with the basics: water, food, medications. The European Parliament has also called for a ceasefire, but a ceasefire under two conditions. First, that the still more than 130 hostages kidnapped by the terrorists are released. And second, that Hamas is dismantled. There is no future for Gaza with Hamas. That's why the European Union stands in solidarity with Israel, but we also call on our Israeli partners to follow international law, to respect international humanitarian law, and to avoid further killings of innocent civilians. By the way, there is no contradiction between solidarity with Israel on the one hand and giving support, including humanitarian aid, to the Palestinians on the other hand. No, the European Union is the largest donor for the Palestinians, and we will continue to support the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and we will continue to focus on building peace and stability in the region, combating hatred and fundamentalism, and promoting human rights. And you asked about the position of the European Union. It is clear that in the end, we advocate for a two-state solution with two independent sovereign countries, Israel on the one hand, Palestine on the other hand, in the borders of 1967, with Jerusalem as a joint capital.
At the same time, since you just mentioned the two-state solution, we see more and more within the Israeli government people openly contesting this idea of a two-state solution, saying that it's never going to happen. It should not happen. So even like on the more, let's say, extreme part of the government, even call for reoccupation of Gaza. So how can the EU convince someone to respect rules that obviously they do not, or international resolutions that they obviously do not want to respect, and say so very openly?
The international community is united on this matter. The two-state solution is the only sustainable way forward in the long term to find a long-lasting, sustainable peace. And we call on all members of the Israeli government to support the two-state solution. Yes, indeed, there are parties, members of the coalition, who are questioning this. But the two-state solution also means that the settlements in the West Bank, the Israel settlements in the West Bank, need to stop, because with every further settlement, the two-state solution becomes even more difficult. Once this war against Hamas in Gaza is finalized, and once the hostages have been freed and Hamas has been dismantled, of course, then the international community will need to sit down and find a future for the Gaza Strip, but also for the Palestinian self-administration in general. And here we will need to sit down with all important partners, including the United States, but also important Arab countries in the neighborhood of Palestine, of the West Bank and Gaza.
And since you've been very clear that the condition for a ceasefire and for the conflict to end is the dissolution of Hamas, do you think, as the situation is, that it is a realistic expectation that either Hamas will be defeated militarily and will dissolve, or that Palestinians will decide to suspend, let's say, any kind of support to Hamas and make it basically a banned organization that will be dissolved de facto?
As long as Hamas is active, there can be no future for Gaza, no sustainable future for Gaza. And Hamas has brought so much harm also to the people in Palestine in the Gaza Strip who are suffering. And by the way, the war in Gaza could be finished tomorrow if Hamas gave up, if Hamas surrendered, and especially if Hamas would free and release the remaining more than 130 hostages.
And you mentioned that the EU, you mentioned rightly that the EU is the biggest international donor to Palestine. And you say, yes, the EU needs to maintain its humanitarian support to Palestine because it's a separate issue from supporting Israel's right to defend itself. Someone in the chat is asking whether the EU supporting Palestine and the humanitarian aid also includes maintaining funding for the UN agency in charge of supporting Gaza, which, as you know, there's been a number of polemics on the potential involvement of the staff of the UNRWA in the attacks on the 7th of October.
Well, UNRWA, of course, plays a very important role in the region. And for many years, UNRWA, this United Nations agency, has played a crucial role in supporting Palestinians in need with vital services. And the European Union is a large donor of UNRWA. Now, the allegations regarding the activities or behavior of some of the organization's staff during and after the Hamas terror attack on Israel on the 7th of October are, for me, appalling. UNRWA must fully investigate these allegations and take immediate actions against all those involved. The United Nations led internal investigation and the dialogue with UNRWA representatives are steps in the right direction, but we are still waiting for results. And one thing is clear for me, the basic principle for all EU funds must be guaranteed at all times, not a single cent for terror. Anyone who calls Israel's existence into question cannot receive any money. So I know exactly what valuable work UNRWA has done, is doing, and given the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip and the unprecedented plight of the civilian population, the European Union and the member states and other donors must and will continue providing life-saving assistance to the people in need, in line with humanitarian principles. UNRWA plays an important role, but it's up to UNRWA now to make sure that these investigations can be conducted in a proper way, and that's why I wish former French Foreign Minister, the former French Minister, all the best for her important work with her team.
Moving on to another part of the world, China. China is a focus of many things in terms of foreign policy and especially in the transatlantic dialogue. And there's been discussion on whether the EU has been a bit too naive or not hawkish enough when it comes to the relation with China, particularly on the according to the assessment of the Americans. How do you see a balanced EU-China relations?
Well, China undoubtedly is the biggest geopolitical challenge Europe is facing long-term under the leadership of President Xi Jinping. The People's Republic has stated on numerous occasions that it wants to be the dominant world power by 2049. And the big difference between China and any other country in the world is that China is the only country that has the intention and the economic, technological, and military means to transform the global order. That makes China such a challenge for us. China has changed, and that means that we in Europe have to readjust our policy towards the People's Republic, and we should draw the right lessons we have learned from the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. What does that mean concretely? China for us is many things in one. China is a cooperation partner, China is an economic competitor, but China is also a geopolitical rival. Or you could formulate it probably the best way with the three C's, and I'm quoting Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, my former colleague. we need to cooperate with China, we need to compete with China, but we also need to confront China when necessary. So that is the way forward. I believe that in dealing with China, we have to be very principled on the one hand, telling the Chinese exactly what our expectations are, what ideas we have, where we agree, where we don't agree. And economically, it's not about decoupling from China, it's about de-risking the China business. I am thankful that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has summed up these basic principles of our policy towards China in a number of speeches and policy documents. Completely decoupling from China would neither be in our interest, nor would it be realistic. China is too big, China is too powerful, China is too interconnected with our economies for that. It's about de-risking, not decoupling. De-risking is the order of the day.
You mentioned it. China is very specific in that it has the ambition and it has potentially the mean to change the world order if it wanted to. And many see coming like the opposition between China and the US that at some point will come to a head. And with the rising tension between them, especially as China is becoming more and more assertive when it comes to Taiwan, for instance, where the EU should stand, because in the end, like you said, yeah, we have to de-risk our relationship, we de-risk our relations with China, but at some point, if there is aggressive behavior from China, for instance, towards Taiwan, should the EU sit that one out, or should it go very clearly in support of Taiwan and potentially side with the US in a response to that?
Well, the European Union's position on Taiwan is clear. We follow the One China policy. We understand that China sees Taiwan as an integral part of the People's Republic of China, but we also note the fact that we have the One China policy, but we have two very different systems. Taiwan is a democratic country. Taiwan has democratic elections, the change of government after democratic elections, something very different than what we're seeing in China, where the Communist Party is ruling for many decades now without ever facing any kind of competition. We have been clear towards China that we believe the status quo as it is now should be respected by all sides, and that we have also made clear that any attempts to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait would have serious economic and political consequences.
Still on China, but also switching a bit to the geopolitical, let's say, position of the EU and in comparison to China, to the EU, etc., to the US, etc. China, as you know, has launched a decade ago now the Belt and Road Initiative, which is supposed to be this huge investment wave of China, which has been seen as actually some demonstration of soft power of China trying to buy geopolitical influence across the world. The EU has been trying to answer with its own initiative. Now that we're 10 years down the line, like how do you see this Belt and Road Initiative? Do you see that as a success, as something that is potentially dangerous that the EU should counter further? How do you see that?
Well, I think it took us a long time to realize that the Belt and Road Initiative is not only an economic project, it's a highly political, it's a geopolitical project. It's one element of the Chinese strategy to strengthen, to increase their influence around the globe. I think that many countries who have been dealing with China as regards Belt and Road Initiative projects have found out that there are a lot of strings attached to the Chinese engagement. We all know of examples of debt trap policy, and that partners of China are now suffering. Now, of course, it's always an independent choice of a country, of a state, to engage with China, and if yes, in what kind of form? But the one thing was to criticize the Belt and Road Initiative. The other thing was that we Europeans needed to present an alternative, and that's why I very much welcome the Global Gateway Strategy, which is our European answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, and the European Global Strategy is closely coordinated with a similar project of the US administration. We, I believe, as Global Strategy can make a real impact on making the world greener, fighting climate change, making economies more resilient, improving infrastructure, but in a sustainable way. Engagement with the European Union is not about making third countries dependent. That is the big difference to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
And still on geopolitics, the European Commission 4 years ago, Ursula von der Leyen said that a commission would be a geopolitical commission. 4 years later, we are approaching the EU elections and the future European Commission. Is the EU a geopolitical power? Has the Commission achieved its objective of making the EU more geopolitical? Has the Commission really taken a stance of thinking geopolitics?
We have moved forward on this matter, and Ursula von der Leyen announced in 2019 she wanted to make her commission a geopolitical commission, the European Union a geopolitical player, without knowing what would happen. I think our rock-solid support for Ukraine has shown that we are ready to support in solidarity countries which are under attack. The European Union has coordinated the international support for Ukraine together with the Americans, but it is a global alliance reaching from Canada to New Zealand. So that's the one point I wanted to make. The global strategy we just discussed is also a concrete infrastructure project worldwide where we can flag as a European Union what we are doing. The European Union has stepped up its engagement with Africa, with the African Union, with Latin and Central American countries. We have stepped up our engagement with ASEAN. We've concluded trade deals with New Zealand and Chile. We're still negotiating the Mercosur agreement, the Australia agreement. The Commission has announced that in the next term, we might be able to conclude negotiations with Indonesia and India. So the European Union is certainly a global player. But answering your question, if you look at the different pillars of the European Union's external policy, it's obvious that on trade, we are a world power. On development, we are also the leading world power. We give more for development purposes than the United States of America or the People's Republic of China. We are proud of this, and we are the strongest soft power in the world. But where we need to really get more active is on the common foreign and security policy, and especially on the common defense and security policy. Here we need to make concrete steps forward, because in the end we need hard power qualities to find eye level with other players in the world. A final point, in the end, the question how our common foreign and security policy will be conducted in the next years, how it will be developed, mainly depends on the 27 member states. It's up to the 27 member states, the heads of state and government, the foreign ministers, to define very concretely how the European Union can move forward to actually becoming a geopolitical player, how to become a geopolitical power.
And should they have then a veto power? Because there's a debate on whether we should maintain the unanimity principle on foreign affairs.
Well, the European Parliament has been very clear here. We propose that we should move from unanimity to qualified majority voting. This is the majority position of the European Parliament, but I want to say that there are also colleagues who are of different opinion. It really much depends on the debate in the individual member state. But the position of the European Union, the European Parliament has been, we want to move to qualified majority voting, because We simply believe that in the year 2024, the idea that a single member state can block a decision-making process, or at least delay a decision-making process, that's difficult to understand, that's difficult to sell. Instead of now debating a fundamental treaty reform, which will take a long, long time, the European Parliament has, at a number of occasions, proposed that we should use the options of the so-called passerelle clause in the treaty, that we move step by step to qualified majority voting, especially in fields where it's not about dealing with questions of national sovereignty, when it's not about dealing with military or defense issues. I'll give you one example. Sanctions against third countries, against third actors, is something which I believe should not require a unanimous decision. If there's one country which wants to abstain, then okay.
We're reaching the end, so I will have quickly my two final questions. We talked about China, we talked about Ukraine, about Israel, Hamas, etc. Is there currently a foreign affairs issue that you think is below the radar but is actually very important and should be discussed much more?
Well, there are a number of issues I would like to mention. First of all, in the next term, we need to improve our relations further with India. India is a very important player. It's now the country with the biggest population in the world. We don't agree on India on all matters, but India is a democracy and we share a lot of same values. So I think to step up our engagement with India and also Indonesia, the two big democracies in the Indo-Pacific, is something we need to pay more attention to. Then second, I would like to mention our relations with the United Kingdom. After Brexit, we all regretted that there was no chapter for a cooperation on defense and security and foreign affairs in the trade and cooperation agreement with the United Kingdom. But we have seen some movement in London now. I think that we should, when we are step by step improving the trade and cooperation agreement, a more coordinated cooperation in this field would be of added value for all. And then finally, enlargement. Enlargement plays an important role. We have 27 countries in the European Union, but there are 47 countries in Europe. So 20 of these European countries are not in the EU. And out of these 20, 10 have, in some kind of way, taken a political decision that they want to join the European Union at a certain stage. The 6 Western Balkan countries, Turkey, and the 3 Eastern European countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I don't believe that any of these 10 countries will be ready to join the European Union in the next few years. A country can only join the European Union once all the conditions are met, the financial, political, economic, judicial criteria. But they may be ready in the next decade. And so we need to be prepared as a European Union for possible new members. That's why we need to use the next term to implement the necessary institutional reforms we need to do anyhow, because we are operating under rules and regulations which come from a time where we had 9, 12, 15 member states, not 27. And in the meantime, we need to make a concrete offer to our partners in the Western Balkans and in Eastern Europe. How can we support you on your European integration path? I believe that by inviting these countries to gradually integrate into the European single market, to gradually participate in European programs, just to name 2 examples, is the way forward. We have a clear vision that the Western Balkan partners, as our Eastern European partners, should have a European vision, and we want to support them on this path.
You mentioned Turkey among the 10 countries that are indeed candidates and are negotiating right now. Do you think that Turkey should enter the EU in the end, if it fulfills the criteria? Because at the end, like you said, the parliament needs to say okay, and then the member states needs to validate. But are you still sure that Turkey is as its place within the EU?
Well, I mentioned the 10 countries, and I was specifically referring to the Western Balkan countries and the Eastern European countries for good reasons. But of course, you immediately noticed this, and now you're asking me the question on Turkey. Turkey is a different case. I mean, we have Turkey, the longest ongoing accession negotiations. But as a matter of fact, in recent years, there's been no progress at all. Quite to the contrary, Turkey has developed itself away from our European standards and values. That's why there's a common saying here in the European Parliament that the accession negotiations with Turkey are in the deep freeze. They're going nowhere, and they have now been in this deep freeze for many, many years. It will be up to the member states to decide whether the accession negotiations should continue or not. You need a unanimous decision for that, and obviously there are different opinions within member states, but in the moment, things are not going forward. This is a political question. I believe that other forms of cooperation with Turkey would be, in the moment, better. For instance, in modernizing the customs union, working on a special kind of partnership. These are steps where we can perhaps improve our relations. The EU-Turkey relations have been difficult in recent years. It's been pretty much a bumpy ride, and we had to be very clear as European Union that we stand in solidarity with our member states, Greece and Cyprus, and that we were not ready to accept certain activities, certain provocations coming from the Turkish side. I have the impression now that after the elections, things have calmed down a bit. We are ready to engage in a constructive dialogue with Turkey, but we need to be clear that the interests of Greece and Cyprus are also the interests of the EU 27, because we are all in this together, and that our two member states definitely deserve our solidarity. So Turkey needs to sort out bilateral issues with Cyprus especially, and with Greece, and then we might be able to move things forward. A final point, despite all the differences we have with Turkey, and there are many, many things we criticize when it comes to the domestic developments in Turkey, but also in foreign affairs, we are, of course, aware that Turkey is for us an important neighbor, an important trading partner, and also a NATO ally.
It's been an hour. Thank you very much, David McAllister, for answering my question. Before you go, if people have to understand, to remember one thing about the approach of the EU on foreign affairs and defense, what would be your message to them?
The European Union needs to better coordinate its common foreign and security policy. We are stronger and better off together. And this principle has been very successfully applied in many other policy fields. And we now, in the next years, need to get serious on our CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, but also on our CSDP, the CDSP, the Common Defense and Security Policy. These are two very important points. I believe that the European Defense Union is one of the key projects for the next term of this European Union.
That's very clear. Thank you very much, David McAllister. Chat, make sure to thank him for his time, especially since it's late. He had a very long day in Strasbourg. You can follow him, of course, on X. You have his ad just below the video feed. Mr. McAllister, thank you again for taking the time. I hope that you enjoyed the experience. And I wish you a good evening and a good Strasbourg. It's going to be a very busy session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Bye-bye. All right, guys, let me put things away and we can do the debrief and discuss everything. Up, Zoom, goodbye, Zoom. There we go. All right, very dense interview. Many things. I mean, we could have stayed like 3 hours. We could still have discussed many very interesting things. It's late. Sorry. Again, sorry for the starting late. David McAllister was supposed to start at 8:15, but he was stuck in a meeting within the EPP. So of course, he ran a bit late, but that's a plenary session. I've been there. I know how it works. It always happens, so that's not a big deal. But anyway, he came up and we discussed quite a lot of things. So again, David McAllister is the chair of the AFET, what we call the AFET committee, so the committee on foreign affairs in the European Parliament. So he's been very much focused on this thing for quite a while. It's his second mandate. Let me just check a couple of things if I missed. No, that's okay. So I hope that you enjoyed the interview. But yeah, otherwise, let's start. I mean, I have 2 pages of notes in there. I will not cover everything because I mean it's late. I still haven't eaten. At some point, I want to have dinner and I still have stuff to do. But yeah, let's do it. So of course, we talked about Ukraine, and that's the huge topic for EU foreign affairs over the past couple of years, and the discussion about how the EU supports Ukraine in its war against Russia. A key issue that he mentioned, say, okay, yeah, we need to send whatever it takes. And on this, it was clear that the EU should send whatever weapon the Ukraine needs to support the war effort, and in the end allow the peace process, because he's been saying in the between lines, okay, Russia will never go ask for a diplomatic solution unless they realize that they can't win militarily. So we need, if we want to achieve peace, we need first to give all the tools to Ukraine that they need to defeat Russia in the field, or at least make it not sustainable for them, and realize that it's not possible for them to hold what they have. And then they will move through the peace process. I felt like his speech as chair, not sharing his own opinion. Yeah, it's true that he referred a lot as his position as chair, which again, in a way makes sense because chairs, so those who preside the committee, they're supposed to reflect to a good extent the common position of their committee, and especially on something as sensitive as security and foreign affairs. So I'm not surprised that he took the position of saying, okay, this is what the parliament has been doing, this is what the chair, this is what AFET has been thinking. Sometimes he said, okay, personally, I might be thinking that this or that, but indeed, he was mostly in a position of explaining what was the official position of the AFET committee, and by extension of the European Parliament on the various topic. Again, that's still interesting to understand a bit more. I mean, we could have talked further and discuss about what himself he thinks, but I think it still remains interesting to understand a bit where the balance lies in the Parliament on the various topics we discussed, Ukraine, Israel, etc. It's far from being easy topics to find compromises on. Especially outside of the Ukraine topic. But going back to Ukraine, so we discussed about weapons, ammunition, etc. And a key debate these days is ammunition. It's artillery shells. 1 year ago, almost, the EU committed to say, okay, we're going to send within 1 year 1 million artillery shell to Ukraine. Why the focus on artillery shells? Because this is like the experience has shown that modern warfare, or at least war in Ukraine, is still very much a war of attrition, a war of artillery, and it's the one who is able to shoot the most artillery shell has the advantage on the battlefield, and to gain progress or to stop progress from the opponents. And to give you an idea of how intense it is in terms of consumption, every single day, in average, Russia will shoot 10,000 artillery shell at Ukraine. 10,000. To give you a point of comparison, currently, the annual production of France in terms of artillery shell, so the standard is 155 millimeters, but in terms of the annual production of France for artillery shell, so big country, big military industry, etc., it's between 3,000 and 6,000 shells per year. So in a year, France is not able to make enough artillery shell to feed one day of artillery shelling by the Russians. So there's been a huge push to increase the production capacity of the EU because, well, back then, back in the days, the military doctrine or the military ideology was to say, okay, well, we moved away from a heavy and large-scale conventional fight. The war of the future is going to be very swift. It's going to be very tactical, very strategic, and so you will not see like World War I or World War II style warfare where it was overwhelming firing power for a long time that won the battle in the field. So countries, especially after the Cold War, started decreasing their production capacities in these. But actually now we realize that actually it's wrong and we need more production. And the EU, to support this, say, okay, we're going to send 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine, so we need to build them more. And one key debate in this, that was France versus a lot of the other countries, was, well, where do these shells must come from? Like, you send an artillery shell to Ukraine, where does it come from? France was taking the position that since the EU needs to build up very fast its production capacity, its military industry to support the EU defense in the longer run, there should be an obligation that the shells sent to Ukraine should be made in the EU. You can only send to Ukraine shells that are being the EU should only send to Ukraine shells that are made in EU, so that it incentivizes countries to. Oh, did I lose the stream? Why don't I have the stream? Wait. Am I disconnected? Why don't I have the stream? Wait a second. The chat is live, but I don't see the video. I'm still that's weird because on my Twitch part I don't see anymore the thing. Okay, well I'll continue, but okay, I don't trust the thing. So what was I saying? Yeah. I'm still on video. Okay, good. So France was saying, okay, we need to support the development of French industry. See, lapsus révélateur. The industry. So we need to buy European. Many other countries on the other end were skeptical of this, saying, well, the priority should just be sending weapons wherever they come from, whether it's the US, whether it's South Korea, wherever they come from. We need to send the weapons because that's what they need. Actually, it's a good idea. I'm gonna refresh the page. And by the way, I forgot to say thanks Wikileaks for the raid. So if any of viewers are still there, hi, thank you for coming by and for staying. Yeah, you're right, Little Misery. He came back. So the other countries were skeptical about this by European aspect, and clearly David McAllister said that in his view that was a wrong stance to take in this. In the idea, at least, of sending weapons to Ukraine, it's a separate issue from the development of EU industrial capacities. Priorities: you get the weapons wherever you can get them, and you send them at Ukraine because that's what they need right now. I missed a question somewhere. Can we with Vicky's Red? Was there any comment on Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski saying EU states will start making nukes if USA abandons Ukraine? No, I have not. We have not discussed that. It's true that we have not discussed the nuclear policy of the EU because the EU right now, so the current EU member states, only France has nukes, about 300 if my memory serves well, and there's a whole debate on whether the France should extend its nuclear umbrella to the rest of the EU, especially since the US is becoming less and less reliable as a partner, and there's especially if Donald Trump was to be elected. France has opened a bit the discussion, saying that why the use of deployment of the new French nuclear weapon would stay exclusively under the sole decision of France. It would be it would still be French nuclear weapons. There is a debate on how France could add the EU more into the umbrella, because that's Macron has been saying, yeah, our nuclear weapons are there for to protect the vital interest of France, and obviously Europe is a bit as a part in these vital interests. So we should start a discussion on how to share a bit the benefit, but also implied share the burden, because maintaining nuclear weapons, it's expensive. So probably France would be seeking to say, okay, you want me to cover you, well, you need to also write me a check, because these weapons are not building and maintaining themselves. And countries cannot develop themselves nuclear weapons because they have signed a bunch of treaties, and it's not certain that either France or the US would be supportive of them to develop their own nuclear weapons. I think the Minister of Poland wants more state with nukes. Germany, maybe Poland and Italy. Well, he may be willing to have that. Unlikely that it would happen. I mean, in the short term. I believe most, if not all, countries have signed the... all the EU countries have signed the non-proliferation agreement. So there is an international agreement. So you have, 9 countries in the world that have legally or unofficially the nuclear weapons. You have an international agreement that says that where most countries around the world committed to not develop nuclear weapons. Why? Because the risk, it was understood that the risk of nuclear proliferation was a risk for everyone, because the more nuclear weapons are out there, the more risk there is that someone will press the button and that everything will go to shit. So there is international agreement where countries agreed to not pursue nuclear weapon in exchange, for instance, of support to develop civil nuclear power. So you have a few examples of that. For instance, not Saudi Arabia, South Africa, for instance, at some point agreed to. They were pursuing their own nuclear program, and they agreed to put an end to it in exchange for support in terms of civil nuclear. There are a few rogues. Israel, for instance, has nukes, even if they deny it. We know that India and Pakistan have nukes that they developed. North Korea has nukes. We know that Iran is pursuing a nuclear program. But the idea is that still countries commit to not seek nuclear weapons, because it would be too much of a risk. And also in the case of the West, well, the argument was, we already have the US to protect us with their own nuclear umbrella, so we don't need to have our own nukes. But yeah, if a country wanted to develop their own nuclear weapons, they would have to leave these international agreements, which would be costly politically, let's say. What else did we discuss? Many things. On the conditions, like to end the war, something that was interesting was saying, of course, the preconditions to any end of the war in Ukraine would be that Russia leave the country, so you cannot freeze the conflicts and leave the territorial gains of Russia. And also he implied, he said, going back to the borders of Ukraine in 2014, which means before Crimea was annexed by Russia, because as you may remember, in 2015, Crimea was illegally annexed by Russia, who organized a bullshit referendum to justify it, and then they just occupy Crimea and say, okay, now that's mine. And so then McAllister is saying, okay, the end of the conflict is not just the Russian forces leaving the territory that they invaded in 2022, it's also giving back Crimea. So we're not giving up on any part of the Ukrainian territory, and only then can the conflict end. So I thought it was interesting, this link with Crimea, because there's a lot of discussions on whether Ukraine should in the end maybe agree to lose some territory in exchange of Russia stopping the war and committing to not do anything, which a number of you in the chat have underlined can be seen as a bit of wishful thinking, because in 2014 we knew that there was a commitment of Russia to put an end to the conflict. They promised that they would not break the Minsk agreement. Flash forward 2022, they invaded Ukraine nonetheless. If we go even further back, in 1994, if my memory serves right, there was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapon because back when there was the USSR, a bunch of Soviet nuclear weapons were stored in Ukraine. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, well, suddenly the new state of Ukraine found themselves with a bunch of nuclear weapons. And so they signed an agreement with Russia in the 90s, where the Budapest Memorandum, thank you, Christopher. It's 94 or later, I don't remember the exact date. But bottom line is, Ukraine agreed to give back the weapons to the Soviet nuclear weapons in exchange of security guarantees that the integrity of Ukraine would be guaranteed, the security of Ukraine would be guaranteed. Well, as we have seen, that security guarantee did not have much weight in the mind of Putin. So many people have good 1994. Okay, thank you, Astrikos. So many people have an informed view on saying, well, actually, there's no point in agreeing to give back to abandon part of the Ukraine territory, because in any case, he would not stop Putin if he wants more. So it's not a question of no compromises. It's a question that, well, we can't trust. We can't. The only benefit of the compromise is that, okay, we give a little bit, in exchange, Russia would just stop. The problem is that there's no sign that Russia would stop. So it's kind of a moot point to seek a compromise with people who don't respect actually compromises. Huh? That's the whole issue there, and so that's why the line is, okay, first you need to defeat Russia, or at least stop Russia in the field, and then Ukraine will agree to what it wants to agree, but you cannot freeze the situation, because if you freeze the conflict, then that's exactly what happened in 2014, 2015. Conflict was frozen. Well, kind of. The ceasefire were not lasting 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks. But still, the line was stabilized. And 8 years later, Russia came back in full force. So freezing the conflict will not put an end to it, and it would just give a chance to Russia to rebuild its forces and prepare a potential further attack, or even to try to probe another angle of the West. Oh, so when do you agree that France about the importance of made in EU shares? I think it's really risky to block any agreement on that at the moment, especially since Ukraine is in a dire situation in some important zone of the front. Is it possible to do both by ammunition where it's possible and really step up EU defense industry? Yes, the French apparently, at least that's in the articles that I read this morning, were moving a little bit, in the sense that they, even if indeed they still think that there is a need to form of bi-European act in terms of defense to boost the EU defense, the EU industry. At the moment, it's true that the Ukraine needs the artillery shells. So the French apparently have been saying they would be flexible in that if need be. So I think slowly France is realizing that this idea of the made in EU / made in France has backfired a little bit, because, well, the production capacity has not risen as high as they would have liked. It's necessary to buy elsewhere until European production is scaled up long enough. Well, that's the argument of the industry, because the industry is saying, well, I'm all willing to, I can build factories if you want me to build the factories, but if I need to be able to justify this factory. So unless you conclude contracts, long-term contracts with me, well, I'm not going to construct expensive and complicated factories just on the promise that yeah, sure, we will invest in you, we will buy you contracts one day, and in the meantime you're just throwing your defense budget at non-European industry. So that's a catch-22 in the sense that if you want to boost European defense, you need to give them visibility, long-term. So we're not talking about something that is 1 year. The defense contract are 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So it's long-term. So you need to have these long-term contracts, and then the industry will then adapt its production capacity to their contract. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg situation. Which one must come first? Moving on, unless you have a burning question. So yeah, speaking of that, next mandate we will very likely have a new commissioner that will be dedicated to defense, EU defense, which will be, well, like as he said, the idea will not be to create the EU army, but rather, at least not right now, but rather to invest, to do this. This industrial EU defense, building up capacities, training, etc., so that one day in the future, all the bases will be set for a potential EU force, whatever name you want to give it. Hello, salut. We're in the debriefing, so I will not last too long because like it's already 10 p.m. I'm a bit hungry, I have to say. I have stuff to prepare for tomorrow. We talked about NATO, so he said, yeah, any kind of defense, EU defense policy must not be in competition with NATO. NATO is the basis of our defense. We must not give up on this. That would be, or try to build something that is attempting to compete with NATO. At the same time, the EU needs to acknowledge the fact that, well, the US might not be as reliable as they once were if Donald Trump is elected, because as you might have heard, Donald Trump at the occasion of a campaign rally has said that if a country that is not fulfilling the 2% threshold, so when you're a member of NATO, you have a political objective, so any country that is a member of NATO politically commits to dedicate at least 2% of its GDP to defense, to maintain basically defense capacities, etc. For years and years and years, most countries, including most EU countries, have not been fulfilling this criteria, which pissed off royally the Americans, because the Americans basically were shouldering all the efforts. And so at this rally, Trump said, well, if a NATO country that does not respect its 2% commitment is attacked, I will not come to help it. The US will not come to help that country. On the contrary, I would even encourage Russia to attack that country, which is basically shattering the very principle of NATO, because the very principle of NATO is a collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on everyone. And if the biggest member of NATO says, well, actually, I don't give a shit about my allies, that's kind of defeating the purpose of NATO. He said that Trump or Biden we will see, but for VA, he's sure that she will have a second run. Yes, EPP need to say, well, of course, he's EPP, so of course he's supporting von der Leyen. He's also he's not taking a very risky bet. Von der Leyen is sure to become the Spitzenkandidat of the EPP. There's no other candidate, and there's 95% chance that the EPP will win the elections and that the council will support her. So he's not taking exactly a big risk in saying that von der Leyen will be in the Berlaymont on the 17th of July. So yeah, of course he's playing the EPP part. Yeah, of course my candidate will be the president of the commission. He's not taking a big risk. Like I would be a bit more. I probably would have stopped him and asked a follow-up question if a socialist have told me, on the 17th of July is going to be Nicolas Schmidt who is going to be president of the commission. There, hold up a minute. Let's talk about that, because that's we might be spinning a little bit. But yeah, von der Leyen is extremely. I mean, there's always in politics everything can always happen, but we're very, 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 very likely to have von der Leyen staying for the next 5 years as Commission President. As it would take like a political catastrophe for her to not be again in the Berlaymont next mandate. So yeah, on NATO, to finish on that point, what he was saying and acknowledging again that the EU is not fulfilling its obligations. That's what I thought was interesting, that like Ms. Derry was saying, yeah, he reflects mostly the position as chair, as AFET. At the same time, he was putting some little points that are like between the lines that were okay. My position is that this should be important, and notably in NATO, he said, yeah, okay, we have NATO, etc. We need to maintain NATO and all that. That being said, it should be remembered that 80% of the budget of NATO, so the defense budget of NATO members, are spent outside of the EU. Meaning that the most of the EU belongs to NATO. Most of the EU represents less than 20% of the budget of NATO. So you tell me, oh yeah, but Estonia, Lithuania, not exactly big country. If you're France, if you're Germany, if you're Italy, if you're Spain, you're not exactly small countries. So you could be, they could represent a bigger place. So here also he said, yeah, the EU also has let's say, to look at itself in the mirror and also respect its commitment by investing more in defense, respecting the 2%. And beyond NATO, there is a European interest in doing so because, well, we have the war in Ukraine, we have Russia that is not exactly the most peaceful actor around these parts. Let me catch up with things. Also, military budget is like spent on Middle East and Asia, not European security, but somehow that's... It's true that also when NATO historically is very much focused on Europe, because it was built during the Cold War, so it was all about preventing the USSR from potentially trying to invade the rest of Europe, Western Europe. So lots of attention was put, lots of forces, lots of money was spent in Western Europe. After the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US started progressively to move away its attention in the Middle East, especially after the 9/11 and the terrorist attack of 2001 and the war on terror and all that, but increasingly also in Asia, because the US sees, for the past 10 years, been seeing China rising, and basically they say, okay, China, now it's you and me, and my attention needs to be focused on you. So for the past 20 years, there's been a sustained and also a concern within Europe that the US was withdrawing a bit its forces and its attention from Europe to focus more on China, because there was no issues they were seeing, they were not seeing issues, there was the EU, etc., etc. When Ukraine is changing a little bit that, but still, it's also a reason why there is a bigger push on EU defense, because notably in the Eastern countries, well, they see that, they see Trump, and they're like, okay, well, we are, maybe we should do something to protect ourselves, have a European defense, because maybe Uncle Sam will not be always there and ready to help us. Speaking of 9/11, that was the only time Article 5 was invoked. Indeed, you're right. Article 5, for those who don't know, it's the key article of the NATO treaties. That's the collective defense. That's Article 5 say that's the part of the treaty that says an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And so the only time in history that Article 5 of NATO was activated was after 9/11 in 2001, where the US requested the assistance of other countries, and so the other NATO countries provided support to the US in the aftermath of 9/11. But yeah. We talked about Israel. I'm gonna go fast because there he maintained a very clear line. Okay, Israel has a right to defend itself. It needs to remain proportional. That being said, he still said the war will only stop once Hamas is dissolved. Realistically speaking, it's unlikely that Hamas will be dissolved anytime soon. So basically, the clearly said that Israel was legitimate to keep acting, and that the ceasefire was only possible as long as Hamas was not existing anymore. So again, that was an interesting position. Even if you maintain, we need to maintain EU humanitarian aid, support to UNRWA. UNRWA that is a bit in the shit these days, because there's been revelation that maybe the members of the staff of UNRWA is the UN agency, the United Nations agency that is specifically dedicated to Palestine, to support the humanitarian needs of Palestine because of the scale of the situation. And there's been suspicion that a number of staff of UNRWA, which hires mostly Palestinians on the ground, would have been involved before or after the attacks of Hamas. Which of course is a tad bit unacceptable, and a number of countries say, okay, we will not support UNRWA if they tolerate people that participate in terrorist attacks. And UNRWA has been trying to save a bit its image and investigation, and also its funding. And so David McAllister was clear that even if there must be an investigation, the work of UNRWA is very important, and it needs to keep operating. How is public opinion towards more defense spending there, seeing how France really never demilitarized as much as the rest of Europe? Well, I mean, the idea of more defense spending depends on where you are. If you're in Poland, the Poland, the Baltic states, etc., they're very much like throwing money at defense right now. I mean, in the case of Poland, it's been a while, but in the case of the Baltic, like, they just throw money at it because, well, they have Russia next door, and if you are the Baltic state, you know that Putin considers that you are an anomaly of history, that you should not exist, you should be Russians. So yeah, you're a Baltic country, you're a bit freaking out. You say, okay, maybe I should invest in defense. Poland, same thing. In the interview with Carlson, Tucker Carlson, Putin was obsessing over Poland. So if you're in Eastern Europe, defense spending kind of makes sense. Western Europe, different thing. France has remained a very strong military, but it was a military that was designed for not for the defense of our borders, because France is like, okay, we're not going to get invaded. It's more about anti-terrorism and more like targeted approach, targeted strikes like far in Africa, in Afghanistan, etc., etc. So there is indeed still a military force in France, an important military force, but it's not a force that is designed for the kind of conflict that is in Ukraine. And the question that is inevitably going to be asked is, okay, it's very fine to have this, but if push comes to shove, if Russia invades the Baltic state, invades Poland, will French people be ready to die in Poland to save Polish people? And that's the key question. There is an acceptance of the military spending, on the idea that, well, military spending still the idea of a strong military force. At the same time, the use of this military force, it's far less clear in terms of political acceptability. Germany, even worse, given the weight of history. Scholz is terrified of Russia, so Germany, it's even worse. But yeah, there's a clear divide between the east of Europe and the west of Europe, and particularly the big countries, especially those who were reliant on the US until now. Eastern Europe knows what it means to be occupied. Western Europe seems to have forgotten the lessons of the 1940s. Number of people seems to indeed have forgotten a bunch of things. Or, I mean, you listen to some of the debates in France on that. You might think that some people have never heard of the Munich agreements. Anyway, I'm moving on very fast, but unless you have like burning questions, China, a big player, geopolitical China. So here it was he played the usual let's say the hits. We should not decouple. It's about de-risking. We must cooperate, compete, and come from China. So here we have the very classic European position on China, which is, okay, we don't need to be too confrontational with China like the US would like to do, but we should not be naive on the other end about the fact that China is not exactly a country with which we have very strong commonalities when it comes to political system and to geopolitical ambitions. So he played the favorites on there, nothing out of the usual. It was clear that in the case of Taiwan, the EU was in support of it. didn't commit on anything should Taiwan be attacked by China, because China considers Taiwan to be part of its territory. It's the one China policy. I will not go into detail of that, but basically, if you want to maintain any kind of diplomatic relation with China, you need to acknowledge that continental China and Taiwan are one and the same country. For the Chinese, that means there is no Taiwan. There is only Taipei. It's a secessionist province that will be brought back into the fold at some point. For the others, it's more of a, let's say, strategic ambiguity. Yes, there is one China because we need to have a relationship with China, but they never say anything about who actually is the legitimate government in China. Maybe it could be maybe it could be the Taiwanese government. Maybe it could be Beijing. We don't know. But yeah, they play on this ambiguity because, like I said, if you recognize Taiwan as an independent country, you cannot have diplomatic relationship with China. Which is why, if you look in your countries, look for an embassy of Taiwan. There is no embassy of Taiwan in your country. The only thing that you will have are representation office, cooperation office, but you will not find anywhere in your country any embassies. You will not find an ambassador of Taiwan, because this is the gray area. Taiwan, you can maintain de facto diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but you cannot call it an embassy. You cannot give a formal state recognition of Taiwan, because otherwise China will say, you're screwing up, we cut ties with you. He did call Taiwan a country. He said that there was two systems. He talked about the system more than a country. He says the status quo is better. We need to maintain the status quo. I will have to watch the replay. I don't think he especially mentioned the country. He said there are two systems. He said there's two different systems. China sanctioned one of the Baltic countries after Taiwan opened some kind of office. Yeah, indeed. I think it was Lithuania. Lithuania opened an office representing Taiwan in his country. China got pissed. Why? Because the name of that was representation of Taiwan, and not representation of Taipei. China considers that Taiwan, any use of the word Taiwan, is a recognition de facto of the independence of Taiwan, and so you're breaching the one China policy. Taipei is the name of the province in China. So if you say I am having a representation of Taipei, that's fine, according to China, because in the end they say, okay, it's a regional representation. It's a representation of one of our region. It's a breakaway region, but it's a region nonetheless. Taiwan is a different. And since Lithuania said, I'm opening a representative office of Taiwan, they took the piss and took sanctions against Lithuania. And there it was overplayed. It was Taiwan putting pressure and trying to divide the Europeans, etc. The Europeans stick to Lithuania, saying to China, okay, no, you cannot take this kind of sanctions against Lithuania. You cannot restrict their trade with them. That's not legal. You should not be able to do that, and we won't support that. But yeah, indeed, you're right. China sanctioned Lithuania. I think it was Lithuania, because of the name of an office. Because it was called Office of Taiwan and not Office of Taipei. That's how sensitive they are about the issue in China. What else? We talked a bit at the end. It was interesting on enlargement. Saying, oh yeah, for enlargement policy, we need to instead of doing this all-in-one, like you join the EU and you suddenly become part of everything, say, okay, we need to have a more progressive approach, like step by step you entered in the EU, like you unlock some chapters, you get a partial entry in the internal market, you get more chapters, maybe you get freedom of circulation in the EU. So opening step by step access to the EU, so that instead of the day after joining the EU, you unlock 100% of the EU, you will have already unlocked 90% of the EU because you will have done all the work before. So that's a line that has been, that's an idea that has been pushed for a couple of years now as an answer to the concerns, to the annoyance even of the Balkan country, who are saying, okay, we've been in the waiting list and negotiating for a decade, and we're still nowhere near accession in the EU. So do you want us or do you not want us? So the EU is saying now, okay, maybe we should give some perks, like, okay, you're doing good, okay, you get part of the EU. You do more good, you get even more part of the EU, etc. And so you keep them involved in it, and you tell them, okay, you see, when you do progress, you get part of the EU. You're not just saying, okay, good job, maybe in 5 years you'll get the whole shebang. So it's one of the basically the response, one response of the EU to this annoyance of the Western Balkan in particular. And we discussed at the very end about Turkey and whether this country, which is formally candidate to join the EU, there are negotiations that are in the deep freeze, but whether Turkey could join the EU, he said ultimately that's a decision of the member states, and to cancel a candidacy you need unanimity, and not all countries would necessarily agree. But he said, yeah, clearly at the moment that's not going to happen. The country actually moves away from the EU; it's not getting any closer to the EU, and maybe he said, yeah, maybe an alternative to join the EU would be, okay, we do a special kind of agreement with them to keep them close to the EU, but not part of the EU. I recall China promised to be a two-system one country when they talked about the UK about the return of Hong Kong. Yeah, indeed. That's something that they did indeed when Hong Kong used to be under UK control, and in 1998, Hong Kong was given back to China. Under the promise of the one country, two system, meaning that even if Hong Kong would be part of China, the democratic system that was built in Hong Kong under the British governance would stay. So they, in a way, to say, okay, the day China takes over, it's not going to be the end of democracy in Hong Kong. And so the Chinese committed to do that, I think, for 100 years, I think that was the agreement, something like that. But we have seen already that China has been eroding the democratic institution in Taiwan, in Hong Kong already. So that shows that even if China was to retake Taiwan, the democracy would not necessarily be maintained in Taiwan. On the contrary, China would be strengthening its grip over it. Okay. I'm gonna do a conclusion now because it's late. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I'm really hungry. So I will do the conclusion unless you have an absolute burning question that if I don't answer it, you're gonna die. Please don't die. But otherwise, yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this interview. Next time I see you, it's gonna be a banger because on Thursday evening we're having another interview. Indeed, like Snow is saying, with Commissioner Vestager. Executive Vice President of the Commission, so very, very, very high level in the European Commission. So I'm very, very happy to welcome on the channel. It's going to be on Thursday at 7:15. So be sure to come. We're going to discuss about a place in the European Commission, competition policy, a legacy, let's say, as a commissioner. So it's going to be great to have someone that high profile on the channel. I'm very happy to that we can do this. Otherwise, as usual, if you like what you saw, don't forget to follow the channel. If you have a Prime lying around, don't hesitate to toss a coin to your streamer. That's always very much appreciated. Follow me on my other social media, Discord and Twitter for the most part. That's where you have the program, you have the memes, you have all the fun stuff and the good stuff. So don't forget to follow there. And yeah, thanks again to Wikidex for the raid, and I hope that the people who came here enjoyed the content. And on this note, well, I hope you enjoyed everything, and I wish you a good evening, and I will see you on Thursday night, I hope, for the interview with Margrethe Vestager. Bye everyone. Have a good one. Ciao.